Good morning, everyone. We will begin with the session. Thank you. It is an honor for me to be moderating the panel on transatlantic trade and investment partnership. I'm Andrzej Burger. I'm an assistant professor of international economics at the University of Ljubljana. And it's a great pleasure to be here to moderate a roundtable of some distinguished panelists. Before we begin, allow me to share with you some introductory thoughts on the topic and some of my views from the perspective of international trade scholar. Then I will introduce the guests and start with the roundtable. So the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, in short, is a free trade agreement currently being negotiated between the EU and the United States. Since the first round of talks in June 2013, the negotiations have continued every few weeks. Presently, the 10th round of the negotiations have been concluded, yet an agreement is practically nowhere in sight yet. And there are some substantive differences still remain between the parties. The agreement, as you know, focuses on a couple of things. First, market access, then improved regulatory coherence and cooperation, and thirdly, on setting the international standards. So the estimates on the effects of this free trade agreement vary differently, but in general, they're quite small for the European Union. One of the estimates assesses that EU could grow by around 120 billion euros per year, equivalent to about 500 euro for an average household. Moreover, this estimate assesses that the global economy is forecast to grow by an extra 100 billion as a result of an increase in transatlantic trade. So despite the promising benefits forecast, public opinion has not been particularly in favor of the agreement, and several hot issues were brought to daylight by NGOs, national parliaments, and general public. For example, investor-state dispute settlement procedure, transparency issues, and regulatory standards, to name just a few of those. In my opinion, the circumstances in which these negotiations are taking place are very particular. First of all, we're witnessing a wave of regional preferential trade and investment agreements being negotiated globally, while WTO multilateral trade liberalization, still focused on the 20th century issues, has stalled, unfortunately. Furthermore, growth rates in the EU, United States, and other major economies are decreasing, and on the other hand, government commitments are increasing steadfast. Above all, production processes are becoming increasingly fragmented. This is the topic of this discussion. Globalization nowadays works at a much finer resolution. Many goods that were beforehand manufactured in one single country are now sliced in different bundles, and they are assigned to plants all around the globe. At the heart of this 21st century global value chain, as we name it, is an intertwining of trading goods, international investment, formal infrastructure services to coordinate this dispersed production, and intellectual property cross-border flows. So Richard Baldwin, famous trade economist, who calls this in short trade, investment, services, and IP nexus. In fact, all four of these issues are at the heart of the TTIP agreement. In my opinion, there are several important policy implications of this fragmentation of production within global value chains. First of all, it's impossible to predict which sectors will be the sunrise sectors and which sectors will be the sunset sectors, which skills will be facing growing demand and which skills will be facing the declining demand. Second, future adjustments to globalization will occur at the sub-firm level rather than at the level of firms and sectors as it was before. So this calls for policies that help workers adjust more easily, not sector-specific policies anymore. Third of all, rapid advances in ICT technologies and other technologies will make future reconfiguration of global value chains and displacement of workers accordingly much more sudden and unpredictable, calling for flexible, rapid, and ad hoc policy responses. However, I personally see several important differences compared to any other regional trade agreement signed by now. First of all, we are witnessing two of the largest economic areas in the world forming deep provision agreement. Second of all, both are advanced economies playing a role of headquarter economies around which so-called factory economies are gathered in a so-called hub and spoke model. Third of all, the global supply chain is really not very global by now. It's regional. So what will happen when those two large hubs will join and what will witness cross-regional concentration or consolidation? And fourth, agreement will propel and the horizontal internationalization of supply chains among the high-wage nations. So what will happen when those two hubs form a deeper type of integrations? So these are all important questions that I would like to discuss with my distinguished panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce each one of them, and then we'll have a 45 minutes of moderated discussion, followed by half an hour for Q&A from you, dear audience. So here on my right is Mr. Richard Elsner, founder of the MORE GmbH project in 2014. So MORE project is a broad church of SMEs which supports trade, but which are concerned that TTIP will undermine their businesses, which are the lifeblood of the European economy. Next to him is Mr. Lutz Güllner. He's head of Unit for Information, Communication and Civil Society in the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade. Before that, he was deputy head of DG Trade's Strategy Unit. Next, we have Mr. Morten Løkkegaard, member of the Danish Parliament from Denmark, and he was also a member of the European Parliament. He has many experience in the international trade sector. Next, we have Mr. Aleš Kantaruti. He's State Secretary in the Ministry of Economic Development and Technology of the Republic of Slovenia, and also much experience from the private business sector, which he will be able to share with us. Next, we have Ms. Elena Bryan. She is a senior trade representative for Europe at the US mission to the EU in Brussels. She's on the ground presence of the Office of US Trade Representative, and she's very involved in these current negotiations. Then we have Dr. Thomas Becker. He is since 2007 Vice President of the Department for Governmental and External Affairs at the BMW Group. So we have here one representative of a large enterprise, large European enterprise from car industry. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Andrej Gnezda. He works for Umanotera. This is a non-profit organization that focuses on issues related to sustainable development. So let me begin with Mr. Kantaruti. Your Ministry of Economy has recently commissioned a study which estimates the effects of TTIP on Slovenian economy. Can you share with us what this study shows and what are the estimated benefits and estimated costs for the Slovenian economy, and which sectors in Slovenia will be the most vulnerable, and which measures do you suggest companies should take to avoid the costs, or which measures the government can take?
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. Well, thank you for the question. These days is not an easy job in Slovenia to persuade the public about all the positive effects that we are expecting in this agreement. But we are trying. There was, as you mentioned, made a couple of researches or analysis what this TTIP will bring for Slovenian economy. One that we ordered in the Faculty of Economics says that there will be basically no effects, so zero effects, neutral, and of course this is if we will do nothing to maybe be more efficient on thinking and to go with the activities, how to actually bring some positive effects on this agreement to Slovenia, to Slovenian economy. So what we are doing right now, we put the United States among top 3 markets in our strategy of internationalization for 2050-2020. Also because of this agreement, because we would like to show the Slovenian community that there is something going on, that there is an agreement that could benefit to their businesses. And what we have to do is also to promote all these benefits, of course, and to be very, very, let's say, loud when we're talking about, let's say, some threats that are also involved. What we are expecting is that there will be the most pressure will be on the primary sectors as agriculture, for instance, as a sector as mining also. Of course, then sector as chemistry, as some other, let's say, primary sectors. And that's why these companies should know all about this. They should know what this is bringing and how to prepare themselves. Of course, talking about zero effects, we have to be carefully, because Slovenia is open economy. We, of course, counting on our export. Around 75% of Slovenian GDP comes from the export, and that's why you have to know that we are not exporting all the times to the direct buyers. Let's say we are more or less in these B2B markets. Also, when we talk about, let's say, automotive industry, and the results or analysis from the similar agreement between European Union and South Korea showed that European economy in the 3 years after the implementation of this agreement grew, or the, let's say, trade between the European Union and South Korea grew more than 30%. In this same period, the economic exchange between Slovenia and South Korea grew only by a couple of percent. But you have to know that in this time also our export to the German automotive industry again, for instance, grew rapidly. And this is again effect of the, let's say, agreement between European Union and South Korea. So we have to look not only the direct, but a little bit wider when we are talking about positive effects. And I'm again thinking that we will have also in this agreement there are opportunities, and we try to show to the companies, to the, let's say, public, where are those positive effects. What we are doing also together with the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we are organizing different roundtables. We have planned to do also on the sectorial basis. And I hope that this will be, let's say, active enough so that the companies will really see, because frankly speaking, at the beginning of this process, Slovenian companies didn't care much about this, let's say, negotiations. But I'm very happy, talking about the relations, bilateral relations between Slovenia and the United States, that our export from 2012 to 2014 grew from approximately 300 to 420 million euros. This is a very positive sign that there is shown of increased interest among the foreign investors, also from the United States, for Slovenian opportunities. And this is all let's say, positive signs that we can combine also with this transatlantic agreement. So I'm positive, and I hope that we will be successful on this, our activities to promote, let's say, the positive effects of this agreement.
Your optimism with us. Mr. Løkkegaard, Denmark is on the other side of Europe, geographically and economically speaking. Denmark is one of the core, so-called core countries. What are the estimated benefits for Denmark? Were they made? And what is public opinion like in Denmark? What can Danish companies expect from TTIP?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I think that we're looking at a lot of figures, a lot of assessments, but mostly I think this is a matter of belief, because this will, of course, be disputed, and it is already disputed by a lot of people. So, seen from a Danish point of view, or from a political point of view, because I'm here as a politician, I would say that this agreement is maybe the most important political step for Europe in my lifetime. And I think we have to beware of that perspective. We can discuss all kinds of sectors and all kinds of businesses and details, but politically, this is a very, very important agreement. And coming from Denmark, I would say, I guess we have sort of the same experiences as you have, I guess, and the rest of you, I guess, also, because when it comes to public opinion, since we have no public opinion about this, most people are ignorant. And looking back in history, I dare say that this has always been like that when we talk about trade agreements. I mean, this is not a public issue. This time, on the other hand, because of the transparency and the very idea that this is going to be a new generation of trade agreements, we have this transparency issue, and that's why we have sort of a debate, I would say, because most of the opposition to this is very structured. It's very it's a left-wing opposition, which in Denmark we have it's very traditional anti-American. So it's very ideological. It has nothing to do with facts, in my opinion. The bottom line is already there for these people, and they are sort of fabricating this whole debate. And of course, this is a consequence of the transparency, and I welcome this, because I think that we need this in the 21st century. But on the other hand, when it comes to the bottom line, I think that most people, most companies, most Danish consumers, voters will agree to this, and the opinion polls tells us that also. So that's the discussion about public opinion. If you look at the agreement, I would say we have to be aware of the geopolitical aspects also. Because I come from the Liberal group in the European Parliament, and now Venstre, we are in government at the moment in Denmark. And I think for me as a politician and a Dane, this is the geopolitical aspect is as important as the economic one. I think that we for too many years have been drifting away from the US. I think that this is a big chance to getting closer to each other again, transatlantic. And I think that the American look at it in the same way, I think, at least at the political level. So this is a one-in-a-lifetime chance to bring us together, also political. So I would like to let's observe this point also when we discuss this. That's what I would say to start.
Let's move now to the other side of Atlantic, to Ms. Elina Bryan. So what does the United States benefit from the partnership? So what are the estimated effects for US producers, for US consumers, and for the economy as a whole? And what do you think are the prospects of fulfilling this comprehensive partnership? So what's the state of play now? Where do we stand?
Thank you very much. We're the world's largest trading partners. We have the largest trading relationship. We have by far the largest investment relationship. We are natural partners and natural allies. We're also competitors. I think for us, this is an opportunity not only to enhance the commercial relationship between the US and the EU, but also as some geopolitical elements as we solidify even further our long-standing partnership on all kinds of issues. Doing an agreement like this is not a new idea. It was something that was contemplated 20 years ago. And at that time, I think there was a conclusion on both sides that the conditions to produce the kind of agreement that both sides would not only want but need were not there. A lot's changed in 20 years. There are more players in the system. The WTO has progressed a long way, but is a bit stalled now. And I think it's become the financial crisis has shown everyone on both sides of the water that we need to find jobs and growth for our citizens and our economies. The other thing is having new players in the system have challenged all of us to become more competitive and efficient. And I think for us, TTIP is a tremendous opportunity to forge an even more enhanced relationship with our national partner. Sometimes people say, where are we in the negotiations? And one of my colleagues in Washington will say, round 10. Round 11 now, we'll be round 11 in October. This was never going to be an easy negotiation, and it was never going to be a fast negotiation. This is a negotiation between two equally matched partners that have advanced legal and regulatory systems. We often regulate to the same place, but sometimes get there differently. In other instances, we've chosen different endpoints. But our task is to find an agreement that works for both sides. It needs to bring benefits and opportunities for people on both sides of the water, for small and medium-sized enterprises, which are also the core of the US economy, but also for our colleagues from big business. It needs to be well-balanced, and it needs to be supported politically on both sides, because we are democratic governments, and our legislatures on both sides will need to approve the agreement that we bring to them. We haven't done, there have been lots of estimates of benefit and cost. We haven't done one as the US government. It's very difficult to make predictions on an agreement that doesn't exist yet. There are lots of smart people out there that are looking at things, making assumptions. What we can do is tell people what we're looking at, and I find that increasingly I'm telling people what we're not looking at. But this for us, at its core, is a commercial agreement, and the terms need to work for both sides, but there's also significant political aspects.
Mr. Güllner, what do you think are the most pertinent, the most hot issues that are hard to resolve now? And do you think that these sacred cow issues should be set aside, and we should abandon this single undertaking approach and make step-by-step agreements? Or is it better this way, to make a comprehensive, deep partnership, deep agreement? What are the remaining issues that are not resolved yet?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me here. Let me first say that I envy Mr. Løkkegaard about the situation in Denmark. In my job, I have to travel a lot in Europe, in particular given that I'm German, in Germany, in Austria. And I can tell you there is quite a vibrant debate out there. There is a lot of interest, which is good. We can talk about the TTIP debate as well. But the problem is that there are many, let's say, perceptions in this debate as well. And I think the core of this, and that's why I'm also want to contribute here with this debate, is let's look at what is really on the table, what is really at stake, and not what people perceive could be at stake in some imagination. That's maybe the first comment. The second comment before I answer your question is we talked a lot about the effects. It is true, figures are very difficult to construct on something in the future. We know that. But we have one instrument, and that is economic predictions that we have tested in the past. We have kind of state-of-the-art possibilities with different models. These are not perfect, they're far from perfect, but they give us an idea of the travel. And I think the direction is pretty clear, that these agreements are producing benefits. How much exactly? That is a debate that depends, of course, on the content of it. And that's why my message is always, don't expect the magical solution, because it won't be. It's a trade agreement or trade and investment agreement. But don't expect the Armageddon either, because it cannot do that. It is just a trade agreement. We have, and Mr. Løkkegaard said that, or I think the State Secretary said it already, we have empirical evidence. We have trade agreement. It's not our first trade agreement that we negotiate. So we know what the impact is. TTIP is new, has novel elements, is innovative in certain areas, but it's not a totally new approach. It's still very much based on our approach that we have tried and tested with many partners in the world, most recently with South Korea, but let's not forget a number of other countries as well. Now you asked about, shall we look at a comprehensive deal or can we do kind of bits and pieces? Now, Elena just talked about the political conditions and the economic conditions, why we actually entered into these negotiations. And one of the results or conclusions of this debate was this agreement will only work if it is a comprehensive one, because we need to achieve a balanced agreement so that we don't get any imbalances in the way this agreement will work in the future. And we do not just want to do a trade agreement, which could potentially even have, if it was a tariff-only agreement, for example, could have a detrimental effect on the multilateral level. We want to be at the forefront. We really want to set kind of new standards in the sense of kind of the new kind of approach. We want to show that the rules of the WTO can be further refined, that we can kind of close the loopholes where they exist today. And just to give you a good example, small and medium-sized enterprises have never appeared in any of any trade agreement worldwide. I haven't seen a single one. This is the first agreement that will focus on small and medium-sized enterprises in all sorts of ways. Information on the regulatory side, on many other areas. So we want to really look at the picture. We don't want to be too large, of course. It's a trade and investment agreement. It's not an all-encompassing political, strategic, whatever agreement. We remain on the economic side, but as you quoted yourself, we have to adapt to the realities of the 21st century, which means trade in goods alone doesn't work anymore. Goods and services are interconnected. Goods, services, and investments are interconnected, and we want to capture this and to distill it in an agreement.
Mr. Baker, you come from one of the largest companies in Europe. So can you explain what are the obstacles right now before the TTIP that your car industry is facing in relations to the United States market, and what do you expect will happen? What changes do you expect in car industry after the agreement is signed?
Put things into some perspective. If you look at the car industry, we have the remarkable situation between Europe and the United States, and I think this is unique on a global comparison, that all United States car manufacturers produce in Europe, and at least all of the German car makers have factories in the United States. Henry Ford established his plant in the 1920s in Cologne, Germany. GM bought Opel before World War II. We are, since a long time, present in the United States, and the largest BMW plant we have globally is our plant in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So we are not talking here about automotive production places or markets which are at different levels of development, like EU, India. Or we are talking about a situation where you have some players who pursue a market conquering strategy, at least are assumed to do so, like in the case of Korea. But here we are talking about companies and also their suppliers who work with one another sometimes 60, 70, 80 years. So transatlantic automotive industry is not competition of regions, it's an integrated production and manufacturing and supply and sales situation that we have here. So if you look at that, there are two things where we see significant benefit from TTIP. First of all, BMW is paying 400 million euros in tariffs every year. So you hear often the notion that TTIP isn't about tariffs anymore because there are almost no tariffs left. If you see an X5 BMW here in the streets of Slovenia, which may cost around, let's say, 50,000 euros, there's 6,000 euros tariffs on it. It's 10% import tariff of the European Union minus the value of the engine that comes from Austria and goes to the US, and the rest of that is then that import tariff we pay into the EU. On the other hand, we pay 2.5% import tariffs into the United States. You may also say this is not much, but I can tell you with 400 million a year, you can do better things than just paying tariffs, I would dare say. On the other hand, what we also have been seeing, while everybody has been starting to produce and sell their products on both sides of the ocean, all the authorities, national ones, state ones, have been regulating the car in terms of safety, crash performance, whatever you may think of, in isolation from one another, more or less. I mean, there are forums of dialogue, but at the end of the day, we have very different legal cultures and histories in the two markets, and very different administrative and supervision and homologation procedures on both sides. So very clearly, this is also where money is wasted. As I think nobody will say that the likelihood of getting killed or injured is higher in the US or in Europe. I think if you look at the effects of what we are achieving with, I think, what are the highest safety standards, for example, we have in the world, and this is the United States and Europe, we have no reason to continue doing these things in isolation, but what we hope will be a significant outcome of TTIP is a clear task given to the authorities on both sides to align things over time and to really start getting to mutually recognize what the other guys have been doing, to come to more similar standards. This is not going to happen within a day. It will take months and years of discussion, but it needs a job to be defined now as part of the agreement. And on tariffs, this is something we really can do quick and easily. So here I think we have clear, tangible, and overdue benefits from TTIP for our industry.
Maybe just another small question. The focus is on global value chains. Can you share a thought with us what will be the difference between the impact on like BMW and other final good producers that will have head-on competition with the US competitors? And on the other hand, what will happen to your suppliers in the global value chain, in the regional value chain? Are there any differences? What do you expect?
First of all, in the case of TTIP, we're in the fortunate situation that everybody in the car industry, both in Europe and the US, says we want this. We want it to succeed, we want tariff elimination, and we want alignment of regulatory requirements, we want the reduction of technical barriers to trade. This is different from the discussion we have if you talk about the Japanese car makers and the European car makers, the Korean car makers and the European car makers, the Koreans and the Americans. So the degree of conflict we have been seeing in maybe even all of the other trade agreements we have been seeing is not here. So this, in that case, is really a unique opportunity, I would say. Secondly, what we have is a global supply network, which means that, for example, a part produced by a mid-sized supplier here in Slovenia ends up in a BMW car made in the United States that gets then shipped back to Europe. We have first-tier suppliers who purchase their supplies from second and third and fourth-tier suppliers. And very clearly, if we have technical requirements in the future, hopefully, which are the same for the US and for Europe, this makes also life much easier for the people who may not be on the first tier of the supply chain, but maybe on the fourth or fifth. So everybody will benefit from having to spend less money on specifying their products for very different requirements, of having to go through licensing procedures for the very same products which are totally different on both sides of the Atlantic. So it will not just benefit us, it will trickle down, it will cascade down into the entire value chain that we have in the automotive industry, and the price sticker on the technical things alone is billions of euros or dollars that can be, at the end of the day, be spent for better purposes.
Thank you for this valuable business perspective. Mr. Elsner, what are your main critiques of TTIP? So you stress in your work the importance of SMEs as the backbone of the economy. So what do you think will be the effects on the SMEs? What are your concerns?
Good morning. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I also want to commend the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Slovenia for inviting me, because the views of my organization are relatively well known. We have doubts, okay? We've made those clear, and I'm very happy to try and formulate them clearly here for you so that you can see. And I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was right to invite me, I think, because not only out of a democratic principle, which is it's good to hear all the views, but also because the issue of SMEs, as I hope you will appreciate once I've spoken, is critical, I believe, both to this agreement, but also to Europe. And so it's better to know in advance what the risks might be than afterwards. As Harold Christensen, the ex-president of Harvard College, said, if you think knowledge is expensive, try ignorance. So I see my role here as trying to bring a little bit of knowledge based on facts. And of course, nothing is sure about the future, as some of the other speakers have said. Yogi Berra, the famous catcher of the New York Yankees, said, prediction is really difficult, particularly about the future. And I think that's absolutely right. And so none of us really know. We don't know because the agreement has not yet been negotiated. And also, even when negotiated, it's very difficult to know exactly what the impacts are going to be. I want to make 3 points about SMEs. And I'm going to back those up with some facts. So bear with me if I use figures, but I can see no other way to do it if I'm going to inform you. All of these figures come from either the European Commission or from reports that they have themselves commissioned themselves. Okay, so this is not some sort of flaky left-wing group. These are all sort of, how can I say, trustworthy sources. The first point I want to make is that SMEs are very important to Europe. Don't mess with SMEs. SMEs currently represent, across Europe, 99.6% of all the companies. They currently employ 60% of all of the employees in Europe. They represent more than 55% of all of the value added produced in Europe and over 25% of the GDP. Now, I don't know what you think is big. I think that's pretty big. And I say that because actually when people hear small and medium size, they think, oh, this must be some sort of, flaky garage in the back streets. Not at all. This is serious business. Second point I want to make is that these SMEs in Europe are just only beginning to recover from the Great Recession. In the annual report produced by the Commission in 2014 about SMEs, they said that over the whole patch, SMEs have not recovered in terms of number of firms, in terms of number of employees, and in terms of value added to the position they were in 2008. So actually, we're talking about an element in the fabric of Europe which is actually quite vulnerable. Ask any owner of an SME enterprise whether or not this is a fat time or a lean time. You'll get the same answer. It is pretty lean. My third point I want to make is that I think that potentially, if it's done wrong, TTIP could harm quite a lot of SMEs. And I've got two principal reasons for saying that. And I'm not saying this is the truth, but this is the best that we can do. And if you have other data, let us know. The first thing is about trade distortion. No one knows exactly how much of the current trade that's taking place within the EU is going to be diverted towards the USA. There have been different reports. The most perhaps reliable report is the one commissioned by the CEPR in London, which said that basically they expect around 74 billion worth of current exports that are taking place within Europe will now be directed towards the USA. Yeah? Of which 39 billion are likely to be in the car industry, 13 billion in the electricals industry, and 13 billion in the chemicals industry. I mention that because actually this is very important for a country like Slovenia, which is an exporting nation, but also does a lot of exporting, for example, to Germany. 22% of its trade is with Germany. If indeed a fair amount of the parts which are currently supplied by Slovenian manufacturers are no longer supplied because the trade is taking place now between German manufacturers and the USA, then actually that could be really quite a danger. So that's one factor, the factor of trade distortion, and we don't actually know how big that factor is going to be, but it could be quite significant. I ask you this in geopolitical terms, is that actually, while we're still building Europe, which we are, and we know how difficult that is this really a time for actually diminishing the amount of integration economically between the European states and between... I wonder whether we are in a position to enter into such an agreement when we ourselves are far from united. The second point why TTIP could be a threat to SMEs is this. As you know, probably, regulations are very important to how expensive a product eventually turns out to be. In a wide range of sectors, regulations in the USA are lower than they are in Europe. Not in all, but in a wide range. Therefore, it is easier or cheaper to produce goods in the United States than it is in Europe. Therefore, if what happens is what was talked about before, which is that there is mutual recognition of each other's standards, not a harmonizing, not a bringing up of American standards to European ones, the risk is that actually products manufactured in the USA to a lower standard, and therefore cheaper, will be allowed into our markets and will actually undermine and really hurt our SME businesses. I don't know if that fact is clear to you, but potentially we're opening the floodgates to very cheap products, which could undermine businesses which, as I was saying before, are quite vulnerable. I want to just end with 5 questions, which we believe it's really important to be asking questions at the moment. I published a document back in April called 5 Questions SMEs Need to Be Asking Themselves, and we've got 5 more today. The European Economic and Social Committee published its what's called an opinion in July about the impact of TTIP on SMEs. Now, you may know that the EESC is an important European institution which brings together employers, workers, civil society, and their view, which was passed at their meeting in July, was that at the moment there is no detailed, accurate, or evidence-based assessment of the impact of TTIP on SMEs. That's their view. So my question is, can we please hear from both the European Commission and the USTR what their assessment is of the impact on SMEs? I'm not saying, is it possible to increase by 3, 5, 10, 15% the amount that is exported? No, that's not the question. The question is, what will be the impact on businesses? And let me tell you why. It's because actually about 98% of the business of European SMEs could be hit by TTIP. Why so? If you look at the figures produced by the European Commission in April, European SMEs export to the USA 74 billion euros worth of goods. That actually represents only about 2% of the total added value in the year, which is 3.6 trillion euros produced by SMEs. So 2% of the current production of SMEs is going to the USA. Yeah? It's a very small amount. But actually, that the remaining 98%, of which a certain amount is exports within Europe, a certain amount is exports outside of Europe, and the rest is within the country, that whole chunk of the business of SMEs is at risk if we allow very cheap products in. So my question is, can we have the data, please, which says that there is this, that it will be good for SMEs? Secondly, if the data doesn't exist, will you do what the EESC has asked for, which is actually to do that assessment? And secondly, will you involve civil society and the SME associations such as the BVMW in Germany and the UCM in Wallonie in Belgium, who have come out deeply worried about TTIP? Will you involve them in this study if you do it? My third question is this. The European Parliament produced a report back in 2014 about the impact of TTIP on agriculture. And they expressed grave concern, these are strong words, grave concern that competition from the US products in a number of sectors, suckler cows, beef, poultry, cereals, and ethanol, could have serious impact on the European producers. So my question to my colleague here from the European Commission is, what will be done to ensure that no US farm products come in which have been manufactured to lower standards than the European ones, and therefore lower cost? Look and see what happened to NAFTA. The lower cost will not come in because we do not want to undermine European farm producers. Going to NAFTA now. NAFTA, this is, North American Free Trade Agreement. What it did, actually, if you look at what the US Census data says, it tells us that actually US small and medium-sized businesses benefited far less than large companies. Over a 15-year period, SMEs in the USA grew their trade by 47%, whereas large corporations grew by 97%. My question to my colleagues at the Commission and also the USTR is, what are you going to do to ensure that actually SMEs in Europe don't find themselves in the same position that the US SMEs found themselves in? Last question, then I finished. On the 26th of March this year, Commissioner Malmström, who's responsible for foreign trade, met with the representatives of MEDEF, the French Employers Association. And MEDEF, we know this because of the European Freedom of Information Act, we could find out what they asked the Commissioner, but we don't know what the Commissioner answered. And the question was this: what will your communications department, of which the main representative is sitting here, what will the communications department say to reassure the 19 million SMEs in Europe who do not export about the risks of increased competition coming from the USA? And I'd really like to know what the answer was, if you know. Thank you.
Thank you. You have addressed some important issues like trade distortion, which I will allow also Mr. Baker and Gülner to respond later on, and also about lower US standards, which will probably also be interested for Ms. Bryan. But before we go on, Andrei Gnezda, we've met on several occasions on TTIP roundtables. So what are your major criticisms of TTIP? So you've often talked about the issues of transparency, the issues of ISDS. So were these two issues properly dealt with during the process of negotiations?
Well, there's basically much to respond to what we've heard so far, and I believe I'm obviously the one that belongs to that leftist part of the campaigners that give out informations that are unsubstantiated, etc. But I'll try to do my best and give a couple of examples. When it comes to transparency, we've seen lately, I think it was a week old news, that again, member states will have a bit more restricted access to information. The documents were leaking out in a perhaps too big of an extent, and that the Commission did not like that, and that now considerations are being made, or even it is done already, I'm not sure, that the member states representatives will have to fly to Brussels to secure rooms where they could read it. But my concern when it comes to transparency is more about the inclusiveness of the process itself. Even if we can access documents and we can comment on them, to what extent are these comments included in the final versions of these chapters, the consolidated text, etc.? The figures that come out on meetings that were done by the Commission prior to the negotiation process itself are worrying. We see that over 90% of all meetings done by the Commission was done by the industry, more or less big industry representatives. The other 8% was CSOs and other public office administrations, etc. So I think the problem is how much will the concerns from the public and other stakeholders besides business be included in this. To the way that it's dealt with right now, the process itself, slim chance, almost none. When it comes to ISDS, it's a perfect example of how the Commission does not want to hear what the public or even experts are saying. We have several parliaments that went out against ISDS. We have experts that say there is no need, or that there are even threats. According to our national study, it also recommends to the government not to include ISDS in the final agreement. There was strong pressure. There was a public consultation that I think that received the maximum number of responses ever in history. And yet the Commission goes forward with promising a new sort of ISDS that will be better, that will be bulletproof, which it cannot be. And the question that arises from this is, what about CETA then, the agreement with Canada? It also involves ISDS. And many are raising concerns that the ISDS in CETA agreement is even less proof or prone to abuse than the one that was supposed to be shaped in TTIP. So I think the problem is that the Commission is just not willing to hear what the either public or experts or member states are saying. One such example of Slovenia is we had some comments on maximum residue levels or Codex Alimentarius. I'm not sure about those standards. And it is clearly stated in one of the reports that I have from a meeting that we have at the Ministry of Economy, where it says that the position of Slovenia was simply not accepted or adopted. So that's a big problem. But coming back to that biggest concern and the leftist role I have to play. My biggest concern is the living agreement concept, or the regulatory cooperation chapter and all its sectoral parts that are coming. I think this is a living agreement that just might end or kill democracy. I'm being provocative here, but there is some truth in this joke. Why? We're talking about regulatory cooperation that aims to harmonize existing legislation or do mutual recognition and provide mechanisms that would sort of prevent future discrepancies between the EU and US way of lawmaking and laws itself. But if we see all these instruments, things, cost-benefit analysis, impact assessments, stakeholder consultations, these are all means where stakeholders, and we know who stakeholder is meant by in these negotiations, are means that by which stakeholders can achieve either delay or even prevention of adoption of certain legislation, or either lowering standards. And this is something that the Commission itself is admitting, the EU-Korea agreement that was previously mentioned. I was at a meeting with Sini Raco, who is developing the new trade strategy for the Commission right now. And she was here in Ljubljana, we've discussed, we've met, and she said, we've managed to use this regulatory cooperation, this living agreement part of the FTA with Korea, to postpone and significantly cut in scope. I think it was a car certification scheme, I'm not sure, but she said it. So it's obvious. The Commission itself is saying, yes, we can use that to postpone, to cut in scope. And my biggest question here arises, how can then the Commission claim publicly there will be no lower standards, there will not be any setbacks in terms of legislating key areas that are in the interest of either environment, public health, etc., etc. How can they claim that if they know it's an open process and that much of these concerns that are being raised now by public civil society organizations will happen afterwards via this regulatory cooperation mechanisms that are involved in the agreement? I think that in the end, it won't even matter what will be written down in the agreement on certain sectors or issues, because whatever the industry will want to achieve will be able to achieve via this horizontal chapter on regulatory cooperation. And we have proof or cases where this was done already via similar instruments. One of them is the endocrine disrupting chemicals, where the Commission was supposed to adopt criteria in end of 2014, and by those criteria, I think 31 pesticides would be banned from marketing. I'm not sure about the number. I would have to look up. But then the US Chamber of Commerce, if I'm not mistaken, came to Europe, started lobbying. There were some internal discussions between the Commission. It's all written down. There's a report, a vast report that was done on the basis of the documents that were accessed from the Commission, where we can see that this was used to achieve a cost-benefit or impact assessment. I'm not sure, but in the end, in end of 2014, there was supposed to be a legislative piece adopted, and now we're waiting until 2016 to see what the cost benefits of this adoption will be, because the US side demanded so. There's another very similar example is the fuel quality directive, etc., etc. There are about 3 or 4 known cases where these instruments were successfully used to either postpone, either prevent, either cut in scope. So my question to Mr. Gülner would be, how can they reassure no lower standards, no postponing, if we see it's already happening and we have instruments that will enable that?
Thank you very much for your view. Before we go to Q&A from the audience, I think it's just the right way to, you've received a lot of questions, Mr. Gülner, and also I would like to hear a short reply from Mr. Baker and also from US Trade Representative. Maybe just really short 1-minute replies because that we have enough time for the audience. Please, Mr. Gülner.
Good. It won't be possible to have 1 minute, but I keep it as short as I can. And just picking out the most important. Richard, on SMEs. First of all, we have in the European Union what is called the single market effect, which is not every SME is exporting directly to the United States, but many of them are exporting indirectly to the United States. So everything that we do to facilitate the trade with or between the United States and the European Union, you will not see the direct effect on each and every company, because a lot of it is hidden in the supply chains, of course. And we know that. And we have studies about that. You asked about, do you have a specific study that is being done at the moment? It's called a Sustainable Impact Assessment, which will be published in the near future, which will put a specific point on that. So do not think about the fact that if an SME does not directly export to the US, that they will not profit from that, just to the contrary. And I think Mr. Becker gave you a good example of how the supply chains are constructed in Europe. Second thing is, trade is not a zero-sum game. So trade diversion can always happen. We don't think that TTIP will lead to a massive trade distortion or trade diversion in the way you described it. We believe, and we look at Korea and other agreements, we believe in the trade creating effect, actually, in the element that we do not have to share the pie that exists between more partners, but that the pie itself gets larger. And that is something actually which again is part of the empirical evidence with our existing agreements. Now, you asked a lot of questions. I cannot answer all of them. but I wanted to talk about standards again. And I want to come back to the core point, and that was also just made by you. I think there's a big misunderstanding, and be it because it's intended, be it it's not intended, the understanding lies in the following point. We do want to create a more, let's say, compatible system between two different models. We have different models in the EU and the US in general. So can we just kind of do mutual recognition across the board? No, of course not. Can we do mutual recognition even in one sector, all-encompassing? Of course not. We have a very specific task, and it's also quite difficult, to go into these sectors and to look, is the way we regulate, is the way that not only the overall regulations, but even the kind of aspects are described in our respective systems, are they in fact equivalent? Do we want to achieve exactly the same thing with slightly different ways? So where we have different approaches, not higher or lower, but just different, where is there common ground? And if there is common ground, can we work with that? To give you a classic example of certifications, of inspections, in many areas, take for example, pharmaceutical production. You have today double inspections. First you call in the European inspectors that go via international standards, and then only your production facility is certified. And then if you want to export to the United States, you have to undergo exactly the same process again, because you have to call the FDA in to do the same work with the same criteria, with double cost and double effort. And that is the things that we want to look at. We don't want to look at regulation as far as legislation is concerned. We can't, by the way. There is no trade agreement that ever lowered these kind of laws through the back door. Technically not possible, politically not acceptable. That's why I think this is actually this regulatory part of this agreement is much more technical than many people think. And I think Mr. Becker gave a good example on that. Now, I'm not going into everything, but let me say 2 words on democracy and transparency and ISDS, and I'm trying to be very, very quick. On investment protection. Now, again, one of these things. Investment protection and the enforcement of it exists since many, many years. Now, you can find this positive or negative, but it's a fact, it's out there. European companies have used it most. And they've used it successfully because it's an instrument which guarantees you that you can ensure equal treatment in cases where you don't have access, for example, to a national court, or where you don't believe that you are treated kind of equally and in a non-discriminatory manner. So that's the status quo. Is the system as it exists, and I stress, not what we want to create, as it exists now today, is it perfect? No. So we have 3 possibilities. Either we leave everything as it is, and then we cement these things that many critics, in my view, or of the opponents, also kind of mentioned that should be improved. So that doesn't seem to be an option. Do we want to abolish the system altogether? I haven't seen any call for that by the political leaders for that either. So the only true way forward is to reform it and to go exactly on those issues that should be reformed, that need to be modernized. For example, how are these judges selected? Are they just randomly coming from the private sector, or do we select or introduce a new system that is creating a mechanism where it's a bit closer to real judges and to a court-like system? Do we have an appeals procedure? Do we have? I mean, there are many, many questions, and that is what the Commission is doing. We want to reform the system, and that is. When you look at TTIP is a good opportunity to present this new system. Will it apply only to the United States, or, I mean, we need to negotiate this as well? No, I think we want to create a system that replies to all these questions in a way that it addresses the concerns of the people and of the citizens. And that is the point that I really wanted to stress. The Commission, despite what you said, is listening. And ISDS is the best example for that. If there hadn't been this debate, we would have followed the instruction that we got from the governments. We have a mandate which is given to the European Commission at unanimity by all the governments of the EU member states, and I'm sorry to say it, also the government of Slovenia, which says, "Dear Commission, please negotiate a strong investment chapter which includes investor-state dispute settlement provisions." So that is the instruction, the mandate that we have. So we could have also said, we have a mandate, we just go forward. No, we did a public consultation, we heard the concerns, and the concerns were very specific in terms of how to reform it, what doesn't work nowadays, and this is coming, and you will see in the next few days, and already in kind of announcements that we have made, this is coming exactly into the new model that we will propose. Now, I cannot go into all the other points, otherwise it's very much a monologue, but I really want to reject this accusation that A, we are not listening, B, that this is anti-democratic, and one thing needs to be 100% clear. This agreement is negotiated on the basis of a mandate. And once we have negotiated it as European Commission, it's not the Commission that will decide. We will then submit it to the member states, who will need to take a decision on that. So first democratic, let's say, hurdle, if you want, I mean, in the positive sense, first democratic check, and then it will go to the European Parliament that also has to vote on that. And I invite you to read very carefully the resolution that was adopted in July this year by the European Parliament. It's quite tough on many issues, but it is a clear political, democratic guideline, not only to the Commission, also to the Member States, what the people, the citizens of Europe expect from this agreement. And last but not least, if it's a mixed agreement, and we assume that it will be, then also the national parliaments have to vote on that. So I would really reject this idea that this is anti-democratic, that there's no democratic oversight. We can discuss transparency in all details, but we don't have the time for that. Thank you.
Really shortly. And Ms. Bryan.
Can I just make a strictly political statement on this? I think it was a very good presentation, a very good answer you made there. It seems to me that there's two ways of looking at the world here. I mean, either you believe in the dynamics of free trade, or you don't. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's not scientifically proven thing, it's a belief. Either you believe in free trade and the dynamics of free trade, or you don't. And what puzzles me in this debate is that all these concerns, all these questions, all sums up to a conclusion, I think, it seems to me at least, that all these people, all these good people, obviously don't believe in free trade, since they have this opinion that we have to, because I don't see any proposed alternatives to this. The only alternative I can see, as you rightly put it, is to do nothing. And what does nothing mean in political terms? That we don't get the growth that we all desperately need. So for me as a politician, the main focus here must be how to create growth and jobs in Europe. My group, the Liberal Group, has come up with a five-point plan, five-point political statement on this. We are very, very much concerned about SMEs. That's our main focus as a Liberal Group. We are strong supporters of this free trade agreement because we believe that these dynamics will help the SMEs. Of course, a lot of questions can be made, and I welcome that. But I sometimes I dream of these people coming up with some kind of alternative to all these questions, all these critiques. And lastly, about the democratic point of view, the democratic discussion. I mean, as I see it, there's a big paradox here, because this process has been the most transparent, the most democratic ever in the history of man regarding free trade agreements. And because of that, we have never seen as much criticism as we have. And now we hear sentences like, we killed democracy. That's nonsense. I mean, it's nonsense.
As a discussant, I will not be democratic anymore because we ran out of time. So I will allow questions from the audience, and many of you wanted to raise, to answer, to respond. Do that while you are answering also the questions from the audience. So please, yes, sir.
My name is Josef Drofenik from Slovenia, Minister of Foreign Affairs. I was a trade negotiator for many years. My question is to Mr. Erzner. You were talking a lot about the SMEs, the consequences, trade distortion. So what is your now view about the same kind of trade agreements with, let's say, Korea, Mercosur, or, or regarding the previous rounds of enlargement of the European Union? What was the same concerns for German SMEs going to be, trade distorted by Slovenian small and medium-sized enterprises? Or what is how the same question could be answered in this respect? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, which I take really at face value. We deeply believe in trade and deeply believe in free trade, and we have always done so. And many of the people who are part of our network or in the associations that we are collaborating with have been built on trade. So that's not a question for us. But you have to appreciate that TTIP is not just a trade agreement. It was never designed as a trade agreement, and if you look at the mandate, which Herr Gullner just talked to us about, it's very clear. The European Council, the governments, don't expect to get large amounts of benefits out of tariff reduction. They expect that 80% of the benefits will come out of regulatory harmonization. And this is the first time that actually this has ever been on the horizon, and that's what makes it so important and difficult. It's actually, we're talking about changing the standards and rules that govern how products and services are made and delivered. This is not just about, you want my product? Here, that's the price, and vice versa. This is very different. We're talking about reaching into the very guts of the democratic process on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that we have to be very careful there. I personally am really quite worried by the European Commission's insistence that the US should reform the Buy American Act, which in fact is a very important piece of legislation, not only federally but in states, to actually enable local SMEs to trade with key parts of the public procurement. And I actually think that we should have something similar in Europe. Now that's a radical view, but we should have a Buy European Act to protect and foster many of these SMEs which are critical to the European communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Igor Tasarets, New York University Economics Department. Thank you for the very vibrant discussion. It was interesting to hear all the differing views. First, I can't help myself but to comment on Mr. Lockegaard and say, as an economist, it hurts me that you think it all boils down to beliefs about free trade. I would like to think that the economic science behind the benefits and the costs of such agreements are of the utmost importance. But my questions actually refer to Mr. Gullner and to Mrs. Bryan. First, to Mr. Gullner, one of the arguments that you used in the discussion was, we've done trade agreements before. As an example, South Korea, and so on. But what that argument fails to grasp is the fact that the scale of the agreement is very, very different. US is not South Korea. So my question is, to what extent do your analysis take into account the scale of the trade agreement? And turning on to Mrs. Bryan, we've heard a lot about the public interest into the agreement or about the agreement here in Europe. I live in New York, and I haven't come across many Americans commenting about TTIP. So I'm wondering if I can be a little bit provocative here. Why do you think that is the case? Or do you think that might be indicative of the trade agreement being tilted a little bit more towards into the favor of the American consumer? Thank you.
Of course, these trade agreements are very different depending on the partner. I mean, first of all, the size, the volume, and the structure of our trade. However, there is one point, and that's why I use the argument, is that we don't start with a blank sheet of paper when we negotiate these agreements. We have our approaches, we have our so-called templates, and how we kind of govern or want the governance system of trade of goods, of services, and others. And these are our starting points. And in the end, if you look at kind of what comes out of these trade agreements, or those that we negotiated, they are not very, very different from each other. And I'm saying that because of one specific reason. That is maybe not yet or not here a big issue, but if you look at public services, for example, it's a very, very important issue in the German debate, in the Austrian debate. And I always try to explain, look, we have for years, for decades, we have tested a specific system, how we exclude, it's not the right legal word, but how we take reservations actually, in our trade agreements, which allows especially the local level to regulate public services, what you call in German the Daseinsvorsorge. And that is the approach. That is not only our starting point, but that is the approach that we will also have taken in another agreement, which you can read, like CETA with Canada, for example, and which we also pursue in the agreement with the United States. Now, it happens to be that we have actually a political declaration between Ambassador Froman and Commissioner Malmström that says, on public services, we do not seek kind of the opening of the other market or liberalization. We have very specific systems. We want to keep this. This is not our interest, which the approach is very, or or will be the one that is very likely to be then in the final agreement. But coming back to your question, it is the legal approach. It's the many fears. It's the many, I don't want to use the word myth because it sounds always a bit condescending, and I want to take these fears also very, very seriously. And I want to give an answer to them, be it about how SMEs are profiting or not, or are involved in that, be it about how this is democratic or not. And a lot of these answers can be derived in the way we have structured and the way we have done trade agreements in the past. That was my point that I wanted to make. Can I do a one-on-one? Of course not. We have a debate whether CETA is the blueprint for the United States. No, of course it can't be a blueprint. But we have these approaches. Now, we have one element, and Elena might refer to that. We have, of course, now two very specific systems, and we have our approaches, which in the past we negotiated a lot with kind of smaller partners, if you want. Now we have two big partners that are pretty much, in trade terms at least, at the same level, and we need to find kind of ways of reconciling these approaches. And will that be easy? No, of course not. And I take maybe up your very first question, because you asked me, what are the difficulties? The difficulties are that even on those issues where we don't have huge differences, but still have done it in the past in different ways, to find ways where we can reconcile the two models. In some areas it will be possible, in others it won't. So it won't be regulated, there won't be anything in this agreement.
Thank you. That's an interesting question, which I have, living in Brussels, and often being accused of coming from the Wild West where we don't regulate anything, which is not my personal experience. The discussion in the United States is quite different. There is not, we've done a number of trade agreements, and there's not usually a lot of interest until you get to the later stages, because, as Lutz noted, most of the EU agreements are similar, and ours are similar too. I mean, we kind of have a blueprint. Congress has given us parameters. But I think Europe as a partner is not, it's not something that the American public fears. Europe is a good ally. Many of us have European ancestors. We like European food. We like European cars. Europe's a good place to visit. Europe is an entity, not a country. Slovenia is a country. Europe's not a country, that has similar values, and we trade frequently. So it's not China. Have you heard about TPP living in New York? There is more angst in the Trans-Pacific Partnership because we're dealing with a lot of countries that are a different level of development than we are. I want to make one comment about the regulatory side. I'm a trade negotiator. I'm not a regulator. Trade negotiators don't make regulation. Regulators make regulation. And regulators on both sides of the water are subject to very strict processes that aren't going to be disrupted by a trade agreement. So standards and regulations have to be taken on an item-by-item basis. And I think, as Lutz said, where we can work better together, we will. But it's always been very clear from the beginning that there are many, many areas where we'll agree to disagree. And the last point I'll say is, a US regulator has no ability to change a regulation without going through a very public process that is subject to judicial review. That won't change. Thank you.
Time for last question, please, Mr.
My name is Franz Bogovic. I am a member of European Parliament from Slovenia. I'm from EPP, and I work in Agriculture and Rural Development Committee and the Regional Development Committee. Inside European Parliament, there was a big debate last year about TTIP. At the end, we succeeded to accept the resolution in July. And this is the way I think that it's necessary what's said today. Not hurry too much, because this is a difficult question. And I'm sure that inside such a debate, and debate in national parliaments, debates in European Parliament, there is enough place, and there is not serious to speak about democratic deficit. We use democracy and we speak about this. If I speak about debate in European Parliament, today we didn't speak a lot about agriculture. But I can say that's my opinion that the trade between Europe and USA is only 5% in agriculture sector. But that's my opinion, also opinion of colleague, there is much more problems and differences between agriculture in Europe and USA than 5%. And there is not a problem of regulation or technical problems. There's a problem of development of two types of agriculture last 30, 40 years. So that there is a big debate, and also the report of Agri Committee is part of this resolution. And there are clear messages about food standards and all these things. So that the question for you, Ms. Brine, what do you think, what is the way how to find a solution when we speak about hormones, antibiotics, rest of pesticides, which are different levels, and if there is any possibility to find agreement which will be for both sides. About this study you mentioned, the study for agriculture sector, I read it very well, and we as on committee, we get first this study, then we started to speak about this theme. This study shows what happens if there is no limits. Today we know we export 16 billion in USA and we import 6 billion, more final goods goes to USA than back, and we know this very well. On the level 26 billion, these are figures from this study, should be trade on both sides if there is no limits. But my question is about these red lines, about which is big debate in European Parliament, especially in this field I asked.
I love to talk about agriculture. You know, the thing about agriculture, I'm glad you gave the numbers. We have a pretty robust, it may be a small overall portion of our full trade, but it's an important trade for both sides. And the nice thing, at some level, if you call agriculture discussions nice, about the discussion is for as many interests and concerns as we have in your market, you have concerns in our market. So the effort is to see where we can, and recognizing that we each have international obligations, can we improve the trade? I don't think there was ever any expectation that TTIP would solve all of the problems we have in your market, nor would it solve all of the problems that you have in our market. We talk about pesticides, and actually we have similar interests. Pesticides are important for our farmers, they're important for our economies, and we each have an obligation and a right to regulate appropriately. Sometimes we do it a little bit differently, but it's something that our regulators and our scientists are talking about together. And at the end of the day, the United States is not going to change something in a way that doesn't work for it. And we certainly don't expect the Commission to propose changes that are not in the best interest of the EU. So we're looking for a way forward that works for both of us. And I think that's the only solution that will work.
Thank you. I just want to refer to one question. This is the ISDS mechanism. It was mentioned about the position of Slovenian government. First of all, the government, of course, is closely monitoring the progress of the negotiation. And concerning the ISDS, yes, we were not satisfied with the solution from April, and we gave the mandate, as you mentioned, and we are expecting that these solutions now, in next days, in September, from Commissioner Malmström and her team will be much better, because I really sincerely believe that this is maybe also an opportunity to reform this mechanism. And just at the end, my personal view, why I'm actually not afraid about the consequences about this agreement. Sometimes one can get an impression, especially after such debates, that nothing is happening right now, that everything is, or everybody just wait for this agreement and then will happen I don't know what. Don't worry, the business is going on, the world is turning, and the companies know how to find the ways and solutions. I will tell you on one Slovenian example, because I have to look also regarding to this agreement from the Slovenian perspective. Not so long ago, one Slovenian good company working in the automotive branch, working for the German companies also, and one German company shift the production of a certain model to Mexico because they want to explore the NAFTA agreement benefits. Of course, this is going on every day. And it was really clearly said to the company, to the Slovenian company, look guys, you are good, we would like to work with you, but in order, if you want to be competitive, you have to go with us. And Slovenian company did this. They went to Mexico, they find the right space, and they opened the production line down there. This is especially very important because they're quite low, or at least at the middle of the value chain. And there are many Slovenian companies in these positions. And what is my job and job of the ministry and the whole government is to prepare as much as possible Slovenian companies, whether they be SMEs or esteemed big companies, to such events. Not because of the TTIP agreement, but because of the businesses that is globalizing, that is looking for opportunities, no matter what the agreement says. Thank you.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our discussion. It was a very fruitful discussion, in my opinion. So I will also conclude optimistically. I have a good feeling. I hope that TTIP will be signed because, after all, it's all about people on both sides of the Atlantic. Both are very similar, have similar wishes, similar values, similar goals. But I have to put this trade issue in perspective. Looking at economic history, it is not trade that was the driver of growth, but it is competition. So what I think in this respect, this trade agreement will bring most to our economies is competition, because in my opinion, competition is the best way to advance competitiveness. And I think that as Michael Porter showed on the Japanese industrial policies, it was the most competitive, the most open sectors that benefited the most and not the ones protected the most. So I am very optimistic about this, and I hope you also learned some new things about TTIP. Thank you very much. Let's have an applause to the participants. Thank you.